The haunting of St. Alora's Hospital. St. Alora's Hospital stood at the heart of a city that had long since outgrown it. Though the building was as old as the town itself, its walls had seen decades of medical advancements, surgical marvels, and countless lives saved and lost. As a teaching hospital, St. Alora's had always been a bustling place, filled with doctors, nurses, and students. Everyone who worked there knew it was a place of both life and death. But there were whispers. Whispers that echoed through the halls after dark. Whispers about strange occurrences, about things that could never be explained. Whispers about things that couldn't be seen in the daylight but seemed to come alive when the sun went down. I had been working at St. Alora's for nearly 2 years, first as an administrative assistant and later as a clerk in the radiology department. By the time I was assigned to the night shifts, I had grown accustomed to the eerie quiet that overtook the hospital after hours. The hallway lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The sound of distant machines, beeping monitors, and hushed voices was replaced with the silence of the empty wards. My shifts were typical at first. I'd arrive at 6:30 p.m., relieve the day staff, and begin preparing for the night. The first few hours would pass quietly. The patients would come and go for their X-rays, MRIs, and CT scans, but it was always the same routine. There were the occasional strange cases, someone coming in with a dislocated shoulder after an accident, or a child with a broken leg from a fall. But nothing that would make me second-guess what I was doing there. Then came that one night. The night that changed everything. The tunnels below. St. Alora's was an old hospital, and like most places with history, it had its secrets. Beneath the main building were the catacombs, long, dimly lit tunnels that connected the various departments. They were meant to be a shortcut, a way for staff to get from one side of the hospital to the other without walking through the busy main corridors. They were also necessary, since the hospital had expanded over the years, and the tunnels had been built before the advent of modern elevators. The tunnels were damp, with peeling walls and the faint, musty smell of forgotten things. Some parts had been abandoned for decades, left to decay, and some had even been sealed off. But most of the time, the tunnels were just a means to get from one point to another, nothing more, nothing less. At first, I had no real fear of these tunnels. Sure, the rumors were unsettling, the whispers of strange apparitions, of shadows moving in the corners of your vision. But I always told myself it was just superstition, nothing more than stories passed down through the staff over the years. I'd walked through them hundreds of times without incident, so why should this night be any different? It was around midnight when I was sent on a break. I decided to head to the chapel on the 5th floor, a quiet, peaceful place that was known for offering solace to anyone who needed it. To get there, I had to walk through the tunnels. The hospital was mostly empty at this hour, with the few staff members left working in their respective departments. The lights in the tunnels flickered, but the path was clear. As I entered the tunnels, I felt a strange sensation, like a chill creeping down my spine. I brushed it off. After all, it was just the usual draft in these old corridors. But then, I heard it. It started faintly, a soft sound that was almost like breathing. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, maybe a broken ventilator or some other piece of equipment acting up. But as I walked further, the sound grew louder. Someone was definitely behind me, breathing heavily, as if they had just run a long distance. I spun around, heart racing, but the tunnel behind me was empty. The dim light made it hard to see far, but there was no one there. I paused, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air felt heavier now, thick, with something I couldn't explain. It was as though something, or someone, was watching me. I pushed the thought aside. It's just the darkness, I told myself. Just your mind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I hurried my pace, eager to get out of the narrow tunnel and into the open space of the elevator lobby. But something was wrong. The forgotten section. I must have walked for what felt like hours, but I soon realized I had taken a wrong turn. The tunnel was much wider here, lined with old equipment that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, stretcher beds, hospital carts, and machinery that was older than the building itself. I had never seen this part of the hospital before. The dim light barely illuminated the area, and the musty smell of decay was overpowering. I tried to turn back, but when I looked behind me, the tunnel I had come from was gone. It was as if the walls had shifted, leaving me in an unfamiliar place. My heart raced in my chest as panic began to take hold. My breathing grew shallow, and a tightness formed in my throat. I was lost. The air in the tunnel grew thick and suffocating, the shadows around me twisting and warping. I felt a deep sense of dread settle in my gut. The whispers were back, but now they weren't just whispers. They were voices, muffled, indistinct, but unmistakably present. It was like the walls themselves were whispering, as if they had a secret to tell. I stumbled forward, desperate to find an exit, when I felt it. Something brushed against my arm, cold, as if made of ice. It was like being struck by a baseball bat, the impact so sudden and forceful that I staggered and fell to the floor. My head spun as I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my system. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I saw it. In the far end of the corridor, hovering just above the ground, was a dark figure. It was like a swirling mass of black mist, and within it, two glowing red eyes glared back at me. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. The air around it shimmered, thick with malice, and I felt my blood run cold. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they had turned to stone, and my mouth went dry. It was getting closer, slowly, but steadily. The glowing eyes never left mine. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, darting through the maze of tunnels, unable to remember which way I had come. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the dark, but the breathing, the panting, was still behind me, growing louder with each step. I couldn't escape. I finally burst out of the tunnels into the brightly lit hallway. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs trembled beneath me. I stumbled into the janitor's closet, where an old man was sweeping the floor. He looked up, his face pale as he saw me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I could barely answer him. My mind was reeling. What had just happened? Was it real? Before I could respond, the janitor's grip tightened on my arm. "Did you see it too?" he whispered. I froze. His eyes were wide with fear. I had no words. My mind was still trying to process what had happened in those dark tunnels. But one thing was clear, whatever I had seen, it was real. I never went back into those tunnels again. The aftermath. The hospital rumors about the catacombs only grew stronger after that night. Some said the place was cursed. Others whispered about an old, abandoned wing where the souls of the Hospitals past lingered. But for me, there was no more doubt. Something lived in those tunnels. And I had barely escaped with my life. I don't know what I saw that night, or if it was even real. Maybe it was the stress, the long hours, or something darker. But there's one thing I do know for certain: I will never go back down there to find out. And now, every time I walk past the entrance to the tunnels, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. The shadows of Woodmere Care Home. I never imagined that the quiet, routine life of working at Woodmere Care Home would lead me into the dark corners of a world I couldn't explain. It's been 3 years since I started working the night shifts there, and while I'd heard the stories, whispers of things that go bump in the night, I never truly believed them. But now, I wonder if I was better off in the dark, ignorant of what lurks beneath the surface of that old, decaying building. I began working nights out of necessity. It seemed like an easier way to balance my life and make extra money, with the added bonus of fewer people around. At least that's what I thought when I first started. The care home had a reputation, sure, but it was the usual rumors you'd expect in a place where people lived out their last years. Some of the residents spoke of strange noises, others swore they saw things. But I chalked it up to old age and the mind playing tricks. The beginning. The first strange thing I noticed wasn't too alarming. At least, not at the time. It started with footsteps. Soft at first, like someone walking just behind me. I'd glance over my shoulder, thinking a coworker was approaching, but there was never anyone there. This happened often, especially in the long, dimly lit corridors that seemed to stretch forever. Sometimes, I could even hear the faint tap of a cane or the shuffle of slippers, but whenever I turned around, the hallway was empty. I ignored it at first, brushing it off as just the natural creaks of an old building. But then it got stranger. One night, while I was working in the front office, I felt a chill down my spine. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and a soft scratching noise came from behind me. I spun around, thinking someone had knocked something over or was trying to get my attention. But again, there was nothing there. No one. Not a sound. The whispering came next. Soft, almost inaudible at first, but enough to send a shiver down my back. I'd hear my name. Samantha. It would come from the empty halls, always in a low, raspy tone. No one else was around, and I was the only one on shift. I'd tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, exhaustion, maybe. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woman in the hall. It was a few weeks into my night shifts when I saw her for the first time. I was walking down the narrow corridor near the end of the east wing, checking on some of the residents, when I caught sight of a figure standing by a door. She was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, with long, straggly hair that hung loosely over her shoulders. Her skin was so white, it almost looked like she was a ghost, and her face was missing. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. I froze. My heart raced in my chest as I stared at the figure. She didn't move, just stood there, watching me. The air around her felt cold, unnaturally cold. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like I was frozen in place. I called out for a coworker, my voice trembling, but when I glanced back, the figure was gone. Vanished. I wasn't sure if I had seen what I thought I saw, or if I had just imagined it. But the feeling of Her presence lingered long after I had turned the corner and continued my rounds. The others didn't believe me when I told them about her. "You're just tired, Sam," they'd say, patting me on the back. "It's an old building. Things creak. People get spooked." But I wasn't tired, and I knew what I saw. The Shadow Man. Then came the Shadow Man. They warned me about him early on. "Don't go near him," one of the nurses told me one night, her voice low and serious. "He's not like the others. He's different." I laughed it off, thinking it was just another ghost story. But I soon learned that it wasn't. He only ever appeared to one particular staff member, a woman named Claire, who worked the late shifts with me. Claire was a tough, no-nonsense person, but even she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes when she spoke about him. The Shadow Man would lurk in the corners. Never fully visible, but always present. He had no features, no distinct shape. Just a black mass of shadow that seemed to hover in the peripheral vision of whoever was unlucky enough to notice him. One night, while Claire and I were cleaning the hallway, we both felt it. The air grew thick, heavy. I heard something move behind me, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. "I think he's here," she whispered. I turned slowly, trying to look without looking, but there was nothing there, no shadow, no figure, nothing. Yet, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Let's get back to work," Claire said quickly, her voice strained. "He doesn't like it when we complain. Let's not give him any more reason to be here." But it was too late. The living rooms down the hall, where some of the residents were sleeping, began to make strange noises. There was a clattering, like furniture being moved, followed by what sounded like soft tapping against the walls. I froze. Claire muttered something under her breath, and we both stopped talking. The noise stopped. As well, as though the spirits had reacted to our negativity. We decided to finish the night in silence, but the strange feeling in the air never quite left. Strange noises and unseen forces. As the weeks passed, the weird happenings became more frequent. At first, it was just more footsteps, faint knocks on the walls, whispers that I couldn't quite understand. But then, things escalated. One night, I was walking down the hallway towards the kitchen when I heard it, a loud, frantic banging. At first, I thought it was just a resident knocking there, walker or calling out for help. But when I entered the kitchen, I found no one there. And yet, the banging continued. It was coming from the cupboards, the cutlery drawer, and then the metal sink, all rattling as if someone were throwing them around. I ran out of there, my heart pounding in my chest, and refused to enter the kitchen after dark. Ever again. There were other things, too. People who weren't there. Figures sitting in chairs at the end of the hall that would vanish when I looked directly at them. Whistling, soft and eerie, that would follow me down the corridors. And the worst part? The laughter. Children's laughter. Distant but unmistakable, echoing through the halls late at night, when no children were anywhere to be found. The worst incident happened a few nights ago. I had just finished my rounds and was heading back to the staff room for a quick break when I heard a woman's voice, weak and desperate, calling for help. "Help me, help me." It repeated over and over again, the voice becoming more frantic with each call. I rushed to the nearest room, assuming it was one of the residents in distress. But when I opened the door, the room was empty. No one was awake. The voice continued, clearer now, coming from the end of the hallway. It wasn't a resident. It was a spirit. And it wasn't the first time I'd heard it. Claire and I stood together, our hands shaking, as we listened to the disembodied voice call for help, even though we both knew no one was there. Leaving Woodmere. I can't explain what happened at Woodmere. The strange noises, the ghostly figures, the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the building. There was something there. Something otherworldly, something that didn't want to be ignored. I left the care home about 3 months ago. I didn't tell anyone at first, I just couldn't bring myself to go back. No one understood why I had to leave. The building was old, they said. And the strange occurrences were probably just my imagination. But I knew the truth. The spirits in that place were real. Now, every time I hear a story about someone else working there at night, I can't help but wonder if they, too, have felt the cold grip of fear as I did. The thing is, even now, I can still hear those whispers, the scraping noises, the desperate calls for help. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back, but I know one thing for sure, some places are better left in the dark. The shadows of the museum. I never thought that being a security officer at a museum could be anything but mundane. It was a prestigious job at one of the largest museums in Berlin, Germany, and I relished the quiet during the night shifts. The thought of patrolling empty halls surrounded by priceless artifacts seemed oddly comforting. Most of the time, I would lose myself in the silence, the occasional echo of my footsteps on the marble floors, the soft hum of the heating system, and the distant whir of the air conditioning. The rest of the world felt so far away in those moments. But that all changed when I started noticing things, strange things, things that couldn't be explained. The first whisper. My name is Daniel, and I had been working as a security officer for about 3 months when I first noticed something odd. I was doing my usual rounds, moving through the museum and #39s grand corridors, when I heard a soft whisper. It wasn't coming from anywhere in particular, but it was clear enough to catch my attention. The voice was muffled, like it was coming from a distant room or hidden behind a thick wall. At first, I brushed it off as the sound of the old building settling, something I had grown used to during my late-night shifts. The museum, built in the 19th century, was a labyrinth of halls and chambers, some of which were rarely visited. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whisper was faint but unmistakable. I found myself walking faster, eyes darting around, trying to find the source. I didn't see anything unusual. That night, the whisper seemed to follow me as I moved from one section to another. It was as though someone, or something, was trailing behind me. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I walked, it followed. It was maddening. The maintenance walkway and the mumbling head. One of the more bizarre incidents occurred on my shift 2 weeks later. My coworker, Eric, had just started working with me, and we were assigned to patrol the museum's upper levels. As we made our way through the narrow, dimly lit maintenance walkway, an area that most visitors would never see, something caught my attention. A muffled mumble. At first, I thought it was just one of the pipes making noise, but as I listened more closely, the sound grew more distinct. It was the voice of a man. I couldn't make out any words, just low murmurs, like someone speaking through a thick cloth. Eric heard it too, and we both exchanged a wary glance. The hallway was pitch black, save for the dim light from our flashlights. There was no way anyone could be hiding in there. I moved closer to the noise, but as soon as I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, it stopped. We stood there in complete silence. Neither of us spoke. It was as if the very air around us had been sucked away. That's not normal, Eric said, his voice shaky. Let's move on. I didn't argue. I couldn't get the mumbling out of my head as we continued our rounds. What had it been? A trapped animal? Or something worse? I wasn't sure. The treasure chamber, the painting and the tendrils. A few days later, things took a darker turn. The museum housed many rare artifacts, but none were as famous as the so-called treasure chamber. It was a room filled with priceless relics from various historical periods, ancient swords, ornate jewelry, intricate statues, but there was something about this room that gave me the chills. I had always been a skeptic when it came to ghosts or paranormal activity, but the longer I worked in that museum, the more my doubts began to creep in. That night, as I walked through the treasure chamber, I noticed something strange. As I approached a particular painting, I felt a coldness in the air. It wasn't just the temperature change, it was something palpable. I stood there, staring at the painting, when I saw what looked like invisible tendrils moving in the air. They seemed to dance around the edges of the frame, twisting and curling in an unnatural way. I froze. I couldn't move. Something was pulling at me, keeping me rooted to the spot. The air seemed to thicken, and I felt as though something was watching me. No, something was inside the room with me. I took a step back, then another, but the moment I turned my back to leave, I heard the distinct sound of something following me. Footsteps. But when I turned around, nothing was there. I rushed to the security center and reported the incident to Eric. He looked at me, his face drained of color. You saw it too? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He went on to explain that he had experienced something similar a few weeks earlier. He had felt a cold hand on his shoulder as he passed the same painting. Neither of us wanted to go back to the treasure chamber. From that night on, we avoided it as much as we could. The night of the unexplained alarms. The incidents didn't stop there. A few nights later, something even stranger happened. It was about 2 a.m., and I was patrolling the lower levels of the museum when the intruder alarm went off in room 21, one of the smaller galleries. The problem? The door was locked from the inside, and no one had been scheduled to enter. I checked the camera feeds and saw nothing unusual, but the alarm continued to blare. I approached the door and stood outside for a moment, listening. All I could hear was the hum of the security system and the faint sound of my own breathing. Then, I heard a noise. It was a low moan, almost like a sigh, coming from within the room. I didn't hesitate. I checked the security pass to see if anyone had entered the room, but there was no record. I unlocked the door and entered slowly. Inside, everything seemed normal. The room was empty, the exhibits intact. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. The room felt wrong. It was colder than the rest of the building. I closed the door behind me and quickly left. Later that night, as I sat in the security center trying to calm my nerves, the announcement system suddenly blared to life. A recorded message started playing. But it was strange, there was no input from the command station. The message wasn't scheduled. It played at 3 o'clock a.m. with no explanation. You are not alone, the voice said. It was distant and cold. I looked at Eric, who had heard the message too. His face was pale. It happens every night, he said. But no one knows why. I think it's the spirits. The final night. The final straw came when Eric and I were doing our usual rounds one fateful night. We were walking through the main gallery when we suddenly heard a voice, no, a scream. It wasn't a loud, blood-curdling scream, but a desperate, mournful cry that echoed through the halls. We ran to the source of the sound. It was coming from the farthest room in the gallery, but when we opened the door, it was empty. No one was there. We checked the security cameras, but there was no record of anyone entering the room. The scream was gone as quickly as it had come. I was done. I couldn't work another night in that museum. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, the unexplained events, it had all become too much. The museum, with its history and haunted rooms, had crossed the line from a place of awe to one of dread. I left the job a week later, unable to shake the memories of what I had seen. To this day, I'm not sure what happened in that museum. Was it the building itself, or was there something more? I'm no longer a skeptic, but I'll never go back to that place again. I can still hear the whispers in the dark, even now. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.